I never expected my life to change because of a form someone filled out at a doctor's office. If you'd asked me a year ago who my emergency contact was, I would have shrugged. My parents lived across the country, my friends were scattered between different cities, and honestly, I try not to think about emergencies at all. Apparently, my neighbor Edward thought differently. The first time I found out I was listed as his emergency contact was at 2:17 on a Tuesday morning. My phone rang 3 times before I answered, still half asleep. Hello. Is this Mark Collins? Yeah. My name is Lisa. I'm calling from St. Mary's Medical Center. Mr. Edward Hayes was brought into the emergency department after a bicycle accident. You're listed as his emergency contact. I sat straight up. I'm sorry, who? Edward Hayes. I stared into the darkness of my bedroom. Edward. Apartment 4B. The guy who lived across the hall from me. The guy I barely knew. I think you've got the wrong person. I'm looking at the paperwork now. Your name and this phone number are listed. For several seconds, I couldn't even answer. Edward and I weren't friends. We weren't enemies either. We were neighbors. We exchanged awkward smiles while collecting mail, held doors open for each other, occasionally complained about the elevator breaking again. That was pretty much the extent of our relationship. I rubbed my eyes. Is he okay? He has a concussion and a broken wrist. He's awake, but because of the head injury, we'd like someone to be here when he's discharged. I don't have any family contact for him. I'm afraid you're the only person listed. That sentence stayed with me. The only person. 20 minutes later, I was pulling into the hospital parking lot wearing sweatpants, a hoodie, and shoes I hadn't even tied properly. Edward looked nothing like the polished guy I passed in the hallway every morning. His brown hair was a mess. There was a bandage above his eyebrow. His right arm was wrapped in a temporary cast. He looked exhausted. When he noticed me walking into the room, his face turned bright red. Oh, he actually looked embarrassed. They really called you. I folded my arms. You put me down as your emergency contact. I know. Why? He looked everywhere except at me. I was hoping they'd never actually need to call. I blinked. That's not an answer. He laughed quietly before immediately wincing from the headache. I moved here 8 months ago. I know. I don't really know anyone. I didn't interrupt. My parents passed away years ago. I'm sorry. My sister lives in Australia. He smiled weakly. We haven't spoken in almost 4 years. Silence settled between us. So, I finally said, you picked your neighbor? He nodded once. You seemed. He searched for the word. Safe. I actually laughed. Safe. You always say hello. I've seen you help Mrs. Peterson with her groceries. You shovel snow for everyone without asking. You returned my package when it got delivered to your apartment. I shrugged. That's just being a decent neighbor. Exactly. He smiled. Not everyone is. I didn't know what to say to that. The nurse walked in with discharge papers. For the next 15 minutes, I mostly listened while she explained medications, warning signs for the concussion, and the importance of not being alone during the first night. Then she looked directly at me. Can you stay with him? Before I could answer, Edward spoke. No, he doesn't have to. It's fine. We answered at the same time. Then we looked at each other. I don't want to inconvenience you, Edward said. I already drove here. That's different. I sighed. I've got a couch. You don't. And you'll probably need someone around tonight. He hesitated. I'll buy breakfast. Now you're negotiating? I don't accept charity. It's not charity. It kind of is. I rolled my eyes. Fine. You can buy breakfast. His smile finally looked genuine. Deal. The next morning started awkwardly. Edward insisted on making coffee despite only having one usable hand. I insisted he sit down before he dropped the entire coffee pot. We argued for almost 5 minutes before he surrendered. I didn't realize you were this bossy, he muttered. I didn't realize you were this stubborn. I am. I noticed. He laughed. It was the first time I'd heard him laugh without sounding nervous. Over breakfast, we talked more than we had during the previous 8 months combined. Edward worked remotely as a book editor. He loved old movies. He hated loud restaurants. He had somehow managed to kill every plant he'd ever owned. I even killed a cactus once. That's actually impressive. It wasn't intentional. I would hope not. He grinned. What about you? I shrugged. I'm an architect. I know. You know? You leave every morning carrying those giant blueprint tubes. Oh, and? He looked slightly embarrassed. I've seen your name on a few building signs downtown. That surprised me. You noticed? I notice a lot. There was something about the way he said it. Not creepy. just observant. Comfortable silence settled between us. Not the uncomfortable kind neighbors usually shared while waiting for an elevator. The kind where neither person felt pressured to keep talking. When breakfast was over, Edward stood near my apartment door. I should probably go before you decide to adopt me. I smirked. You'd make a terrible pet. I know. I complain constantly. You already do. He laughed again. Then his expression softened. Seriously. Thank you, Mark. I nodded. No problem. He opened his apartment door across the hallway before turning back. Oh, if you're ever in an emergency. He smiled. You can list me too. For some reason, that simple sentence stayed with me for the rest of the day. Not because it was romantic, not because there was any obvious spark between us, but because it was honest. Two people who had lived across the hall from each other for months had suddenly stopped being strangers. Neither of us realized that the accident wasn't the event that would change everything. It was only the reason we finally started paying attention to each other. The weeks after Edward's accident settled into a routine neither of us had planned. It started with small things. I'd knock on his door after work to make sure he hadn't tried to open another stubborn jar with one hand. He'd text me whenever he needed groceries, always insisting on paying me back down to the last cent. Eventually, the text stopped being practical. Need anything from the bakery? Movie night. I accidentally made too much pasta. Elevator's broken again. Guess we're getting our cardio in. It was easy. A little too easy. One Friday evening, I came home to find Edward sitting on the hallway floor outside his apartment. You locked yourself out? He looked up and sighed dramatically. I'd appreciate less judgment. I haven't judged you yet. You were about to. I was. He smiled. My cast makes using keys surprisingly difficult. I unlocked my own apartment. You can wait inside until the landlord gets here. I don't want to intrude. You've said that at least 20 times since the hospital. Because I do. Edward. What? Come inside. He stood, brushing imaginary dust off his jeans. I'll only stay for a minute. 3 hours later, we were halfway through a documentary about abandoned amusement parks. I can't believe people actually visit places like that, I said. Edward didn't answer. I turned toward him. He had fallen asleep, curled against the corner of my couch with a blanket he'd apparently found without me noticing. His injured arm rested carefully across his lap. There was something strangely peaceful about him when he wasn't overthinking every sentence. Without his usual polite smile. Without constantly apologizing. Just asleep. I quietly lowered the TV volume. A few minutes later, his phone buzzed on the coffee table. The screen lit up. Unknown number. Then another call. And another. I frowned. When the fourth call came through, Edward woke with a start. Oh. He grabbed the phone. His expression changed immediately. I should take this. He stepped onto my balcony, sliding the door closed behind him. I couldn't hear much. Only pieces. I already told you. No, I'm not sending money again. Because I don't have it. Then silence. When he came back inside, he looked exhausted. Everything okay? Yeah. It was an obvious lie, but something in his expression told me not to push. Instead, I asked, Landlord still coming? Edward checked the time. He said another hour. You hungry? A little. I'll order pizza. I'll pay. We're really still doing this. I told you. I don't accept charity. I laughed. Fine. You buy pizza. Over the next month, we somehow became the people everyone in the building assumed were already friends. Mrs. Peterson started asking us to carry her groceries together. The mailman greeted us as if we lived in the same apartment. Even the guy from maintenance once asked, So how long have you two been together? Edward nearly dropped the toolbox he was holding. We're not. No. We're neighbors. The maintenance guy shrugged. My mistake. He walked away before either of us could say anything else. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then Edward quietly said, That happens surprisingly often. It does. He nodded. I think people just see two guys spending time together. I guess. Neither of us mentioned it again, but I noticed he seemed unusually quiet for the rest of the afternoon. The first Real crack appeared on a rainy Sunday. I was working from home when someone started pounding on Edward's apartment door. Not knocking. Pounding. Loud enough to echo through the hallway. I opened my door. A man I'd never seen before stood outside Edward's apartment. Early 40s. Expensive jacket. Angry. He hit the door again. Edward. No answer. I stepped into the hallway. Can I help you? The man looked at me. Where is he? I don't know who you're talking about. The guy who lives here. I haven't seen him today. He narrowed his eyes. You're Mark. It wasn't a question. I felt my stomach tighten. How do you know my name? He mentioned you. That somehow made me even more uncomfortable. I'm his brother. Edward had told me he had a sister. Nothing about a brother. I'm Daniel. He held out his hand. I didn't shake it. You said you haven't seen him? No. Daniel looked irritated. If he comes back, tell him he can't ignore me forever. Before I could respond, he walked away toward the stairs. 5 minutes later, my phone buzzed. Edward, can I come over? I answered immediately. Of course. Less than a minute later, he stepped into my apartment. His face had gone completely pale. You saw him? My brother? I nodded. I thought you said you only had a sister. Edward sat heavily on the couch. I wish. Silence stretched between us. Finally, he spoke. Daniel isn't really part of my life anymore. He borrowed money from everyone in our family. He lied, gambled, manipulated people. My parents spent years trying to help him. And after they died, Edward swallowed. He started asking me, did you give him money? For years. And now, I can't anymore. His voice sounded tired. So he gets angry. I sat beside him. Does he know where you live? I never told him. Then how? I think he hired someone. That made me sit up. What? I changed my number twice. I moved. I blocked every account. He still found me. I stared at him. You should have told me. I didn't want to drag you into it. Edward. He looked at me. I already got dragged into it. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked completely defeated. I know. I'm sorry. Without really thinking, I put a hand on his shoulder. He froze. Not because he wanted me to stop. More like he wasn't used to someone comforting him. You don't have to apologize. He looked at my hand for a second before meeting my eyes. I really hate being someone people worry about. I smiled. Too late. You've already accomplished that. For the first time that day, he smiled back. A small one, but real. And neither of us noticed that my hand stayed on his shoulder much longer than it needed to. After Daniel showed up, things changed. Not dramatically, just enough for both of us to notice. Edward started checking the hallway through the peephole before leaving his apartment. He stopped wearing headphones on his walks to the grocery store. Twice, I caught him looking over his shoulder when we were downtown. He's not here, I said one evening as we walked back from dinner. I know, but you're looking anyway. Edward sighed. I hate that you've noticed. I notice a lot. He smiled faintly. I've noticed. Understood. A week later, I was halfway through a client meeting when my phone buzzed. Edward. I almost ignored it. He never called during work. Then it rang again. I excused myself and answered. Hey. There was a pause. Mark. His voice sounded strained. I'm sorry. I know you're working. Edward. What happened? I think. He took a shaky breath. I think someone's trying to get into my apartment. Every muscle in my body tensed. Are you inside? Yeah. Doors locked. I heard someone trying the handle. I'm in the bedroom. I'm calling the police. I'm already on with them. His voice cracked. I didn't know who else to call. I'm coming. You don't have to. I'm already leaving. By the time I reached our building, 2 police cars were parked outside. Edward was sitting in the lobby wrapped in a gray blanket one of the officers had given him. The moment he saw me, relief flooded his face. They checked the apartment, he said quietly. No one was inside. What happened? I don't know. I heard someone messing with the lock. They ran before the police got here. One of the officers approached us. Mr. Hayes? Edward nodded. We found fresh scratch marks around your lock. So someone definitely tried. Do you know anyone who might want to enter your apartment? Edward hesitated. Then, my brother. The officer wrote something down. The one you've previously mentioned? Yes. We'll include that. After the officer walked away, neither of us spoke for a while. Finally, I asked, do you want to stay at my place tonight? Edward looked embarrassed. Again. I feel like I'm becoming your responsibility. No. I met his eyes. You're becoming my friend. Something in his expression softened. So, he said quietly, that's what we are? I laughed. I thought we figured that out weeks ago. He smiled. I guess we did. That night, neither of us slept much. Around 1 in the morning, I found Edward standing on my balcony staring at the city. You okay? He nodded without turning around. I used to think moving here meant starting over. It still can. What if he never stops? I didn't have an answer. Instead, I stood beside him. The city was unusually quiet. You know what scares me most? He asked. No, not Daniel. I looked at him. It's realizing how alone I was before all this. He laughed softly. It took almost getting hit by a bike for me to make one real friend. You could have just knocked on my door. I almost did. When? The week after I moved in. What stopped you? You looked busy. I groaned. I was probably assembling IKEA furniture. You were. And you looked intensely committed. I laughed. That bookshelf almost ended me. Edward laughed too. A real laugh. The kind that echoed through the cool night air. Then his expression grew serious again. I'm glad I didn't move. What? I almost broke my lease after the first month. You hated the building? No. I hated feeling invisible. His voice was barely above a whisper. I'd come home every day and realize nobody would have noticed if I disappeared. I looked at him for a long moment. I would have. He blinked. You barely knew me. I still would have noticed. Silence settled between us. Not awkward, just honest. Edward looked down at the city lights. I believe you. Saturday morning arrived with unexpected sunshine. You need fresh air, I announced. Edward looked up from his coffee. Is that a medical diagnosis? It's a MARC diagnosis. Sounds expensive. It includes a mandatory walk. He sighed dramatically. I suppose I don't have much choice. You really don't. We ended up wandering through the neighborhood farmer's market. Edward stopped at every book stand. I stopped at every bakery. By noon, he was carrying 3 secondhand novels. I was carrying enough pastries to feed a family. This is excessive, he said. I don't know what you're talking about. You bought 6 cinnamon rolls. They were on sale. For 2 people. I panicked. Edward laughed so hard people turned to look. You panic bought pastries? I regret nothing. I don't believe you. I regret one of them. You haven't even eaten them. I'm planning ahead. Still laughing, he reached into my paper bag and broke 1 cinnamon roll in half. Without thinking, he handed me the larger piece. It was such a small gesture, so natural, that neither of us commented on it. When we returned to the building, Mrs. Peterson was watering the flowers near the entrance. There you boys are. We've been promoted, I whispered. Edward smiled. Apparently. Mrs. Peterson looked between us knowingly. You two make a good team. Edward opened his mouth, then closed it again. Instead of correcting her, he simply smiled. And for reasons I couldn't explain, I found myself smiling too. Because somewhere between emergency phone calls, hospital visits, pizza nights, and long conversations on the balcony, Edward had quietly become the person I looked for first whenever I came home. I just hadn't admitted that to myself yet. By the beginning of October, something had quietly shifted between us. Nobody announced it. Nobody talked about it. It simply happened. Edward no longer texted to ask if I was busy before knocking on my door. He just knocked. I stopped asking if he wanted dinner. I automatically cooked enough for both of us. Some evenings we'd spend hours in the same room doing completely different things. I'd work on blueprints. He'd edit manuscripts. Neither of us felt the need to fill every silence. It was comfortable, maybe a little too comfortable. One Thursday evening, I came home later than usual. The hallway was dark except for the light under Edward's door. Before I could unlock my apartment, his door opened. There you are. I blinked. Were you waiting? He looked caught. Maybe. You've been gone since 7 this morning. It's almost 9. I know what time it is. I smiled. Were you worried? He crossed his arms. You weren't answering your phone. I pulled it from my pocket. Dead battery. Oh, I guess that explains it. Edward let out a slow breath. I almost called the hospitals. I stared at him. You what? I know. He rubbed the back of his neck. It sounds ridiculous. No. It sounds. I wasn't sure how to finish the sentence. He looked away. I've gotten used to knowing you're okay. That simple confession hit me harder than I expected. I should have warned you. You don't owe me updates. I know. But. I smiled. I'll still text next time. His shoulders relaxed. Good. The following weekend, I convinced Edward to help me repaint my living room. I have absolutely no experience with this, he warned. You have 2 hands. One of them only recently healed. You still have 2. He rolled his eyes. This is going to end badly. It did. Just not in the way either of us expected. About an hour into painting, I turned too quickly. My roller clipped Edward's arm. A streak of pale blue paint ran across his t-shirt. He stared at it, then at me. You did not. I'm so sorry. You absolutely meant to. I swear I didn't. Without warning, He dipped his own brush into the tray. Edward. No. Let's be reasonable. He smiled. Far too calmly. You had your chance. A second later, a streak of blue appeared across my shoulder. I looked down at my shirt, then back at him. Oh, it's like that. For the next 5 minutes. The living room became a disaster. Neither of us was trying very hard to paint anymore. There were blue fingerprints on the floor, paint on my jeans, a small streak across Edward's cheek. He was laughing so hard he had to lean against the wall. You, he tried to speak between laughs, are impossible. I learned from the best. I don't think that's true. Oh, no. I was much better behaved before meeting you. I snorted. That's the biggest lie you've ever told. Still smiling, I stepped closer. You've got paint. I know. No. Here. Without thinking, I reached up. My thumb brushed lightly across his cheek, wiping away the blue streak. The laughter disappeared. So did mine. Neither of us moved. We were standing much closer than either of us had realized. Edward's eyes stayed on mine. His breathing slowed. So, he said quietly, I missed a spot. I looked down. There was still a tiny streak near his jaw. Yeah. Instead of stepping back, I reached up again. This time my fingers lingered just a second longer. His skin was warm. When I lowered my hand, neither of us spoke. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Then the timer on the oven started beeping from the kitchen. We both jumped. Edward laughed first. I guess dinner's ready. Yeah. Neither of us mentioned what had almost happened, but we both thought about it. A few nights later, we were watching an old black and white movie in my apartment. Edward had insisted I'd love it. He was right. Halfway through, I noticed he wasn't paying attention anymore. You've been reading the same subtitle for 30 seconds. What's wrong? He hesitated, then handed me his phone. A message from Daniel. You can't ignore me forever. We need to talk. Below it, 3 missed calls. I blocked this number. He got another one. I looked at Edward. You don't have to answer. I know, but I'm tired. Tired of being afraid. I nodded slowly. What do you want to do? He surprised me. I wanted to stop. Then let's make it stop. The next morning, we went together to the police station. Edward filed another report. This time he didn't do it alone. When we walked back outside, he looked lighter somehow. I've spent years trying to handle everything myself. He looked at me. I forgot people are allowed to ask for help. You're allowed. I know that now. That evening, as we stood outside our apartments, Edward stopped me before I unlocked my door. Mark. Yeah. I've been meaning to ask you something. Shoot. He looked unusually nervous. He laughed awkwardly. If none of this had happened. The accident. My brother. Everything. Do you think we'd still have become friends? I thought about it. Eventually. You really think so? I do. Why? I smiled. Because I think we were both lonely. And because I met his eyes. You would have eventually found another excuse to knock on my door. Edward laughed softly. I probably would have. There was a pause. Then, almost too quietly to hear. I'm really glad you answered your phone that night. So am I. Neither of us realized how true those words were. Or that before the week was over, one of us would finally stop pretending our feelings were just friendship. I kept replaying that moment in my living room. The paint. My hand on Edward's face. The way neither of us had moved away. I told myself it hadn't meant anything. Then I'd catch myself smiling while making coffee, and I'd realize I was lying. To myself. A few days later, I stayed late at work finishing a presentation. By the time I got home, it was almost 8. The hallway lights were already on. Edward's apartment door was open. He was standing on a chair, struggling to replace a smoke detector battery. You know, I said, setting my bag down. Most people use ladders. I don't own one. You also don't own common sense. He looked over his shoulder. There you are. There it was again. That tiny smile he'd somehow reserved just for me. Need help? I've reached the acceptance stage. Which is accepting that I'm too short. I laughed. Move. A minute later the battery was replaced. Edward climbed down carefully. I could have done that. You absolutely could not. I was getting there. You were negotiating with the ceiling. He smiled. You make a compelling argument. We ordered takeout that night and ate on the rooftop of our building. The city stretched out beneath us, glowing under the evening sky. I almost moved to Chicago once, Edward said suddenly. You never told me that. It was before I came here. What stopped you? He looked out at the skyline. I realized I wasn't running towards something. I was running away. From Daniel? He nodded. and from everything else. We sat quietly for a moment. Then he looked at me. I don't feel like running anymore. I'm glad. I think. He smiled to himself. I finally found somewhere that feels like home. I looked around the rooftop. This building. He laughed. No. His eyes met mine. You. For a second, I couldn't breathe. He immediately looked away. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. Edward. He stopped talking. I've been trying very hard not to fall for you. His eyes widened. What? I figured if I ignored it. I laughed nervously. It might go away. It didn't. He stared at me like he wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. You? I thought you only saw me as a friend. I tried. He smiled. I failed. So did I. Neither of us moved. Neither of us needed to. Edward took one careful step closer. Can I ask you something? Anything. If I kiss you. His voice was barely above a whisper. Will you tell me if it's a terrible idea? I smiled. I don't think it's possible. He laughed softly. Then, slowly enough that either of us could have changed our minds, he reached for my hand. His fingers slipped between mine. Warm, steady, comfortable. Exactly the way everything between us had always felt. When he kissed me, it wasn't rushed. It wasn't dramatic. It was gentle, careful, like two people making absolutely certain they weren't imagining the same thing. When we finally pulled apart, neither of us spoke for several seconds. Edward rested his forehead lightly against mine. So, he whispered, that definitely wasn't a terrible idea. I laughed. No, it really wasn't. A month later, Daniel finally accepted a plea agreement after being arrested for repeated harassment and violating a protective order. Edward didn't celebrate. He just looked relieved. It's over, he said quietly. It's finally over. It is. He reached for my hand automatically. Neither of us noticed we'd started doing that weeks ago. Winter arrived. The first snowfall covered the courtyard outside our building. Mrs. Peterson spotted us leaving together one morning. I knew it, she called from her porch. Edward laughed. You knew what? She smiled knowingly. You boys were never just neighbors. Edward looked at me. I guess she was right. I guess she was. On the anniversary of his bicycle accident, we walked past the intersection where it had happened. Edward stopped. You know what's funny? What? If I hadn't crashed my bike. He smiled. I probably never would have knocked on your door. You technically didn't. The hospital did. True. He looked at me with the same warm expression I'd come to love. You answered anyway. I squeezed his hand. They called because you listed me. I barely knew you. I know. So why me? He smiled. Remember what I told you? That you seemed safe? He nodded. I was wrong. I raised an eyebrow. Oh, you weren't just safe. He stepped closer. You became the person I trust most. I felt my chest tighten. For someone who picked his emergency contact almost at random. I smiled. You made a pretty good decision. Edward laughed. No, I made the best one of my life. He kissed me lightly before we continued walking home. Home. The word meant something completely different now. Not an apartment. Not a building. Not even a city. Just wherever the other one happened to be. Sometimes the biggest changes don't begin with grand declarations or perfect timing. Sometimes they begin with a late-night phone call. Because somewhere, on a forgotten medical form, someone quietly wrote your name next to the words, emergency contact.